Hello, my name is Matt Nachtraub. I'm going to review with you the July 1st, 2024 8K that was released by Cassava Sciences and the disclosure issues that were discussed in that 8K um, and as interpreted by Cassava Sciences through their 8K. So just at a high level, what they said in the 8K was there was additional information brought to the company by the SEC that caused the company to form an investigative committee on the board. So if you note there's a couple important things that I see. Is it says SEC. And so from a company's perspective, it doesn't say these came from the DOJ or that any update on anything with the DOJ investigation. So it's SEC. They brought up two key disclosure issues, which, if you look through the history, they seem to be directly related to the September 14th, 2020 press release. So almost 4 years ago. In that press release, they discussed two things at length. The Phase 2B biomarker reanalysis done at CUNY. The original biomarker work was done by Lund and was reported back in May of that year. And they also talked about the potential unblinding of Dr. Wang at the CUNY lab. The second thing that they discussed is the phase 2 CANTAB data in the press release did not disclose significant exclusions that were taken from the data and not included in the statistical analysis that they presented in the press release. And finally, and I won't be covering this part today, but the investigative team did take a look and is taking a look at the indictment of Dr. Wang and seeing if there are any actions in the company that need to be taken as a result. So let's get right into what they said about the phase 2 data. So I'm just going to read this. The phase 2B study was designed as a 28-day, approximately 60 patient, reported as 64, randomized double-blind placebo. One objective of phase 2 was to measure changes in levels of CSF biomarkers, the spinal fluid, in the study participants from baseline value to day 28. Based on the CSF biomarker assays, the bioanalysis conducted by Dr. Wang, Cassava reported statistically significant improvement in biomarkers in treatment groups as compared to placebo. To date, the internal investigation team has determined that certain statistical information contained in an attachment to an email by a senior employee to Dr. Wang, which it was Lindsay Burns to Dr. Wang, before the bioanalysis could have actually, so before he actually did the work analyzing the samples for the phase 2B patients, he could have used to unblind him and some number of the patients in the phase 2B study. Okay, so inferred in this is the SEC has some issues with the disclosures. Cassava didn't disclose that Dr. Wang did the reanalysis at CUNY. Cassava disclosed that an outside academic lab that was blinded to avoid bias performed the reanalysis of the phase 2 biomarkers. Also, the email that was sent could have been used to unblind some number of patients in the study. And finally, and I think this is really the meat of a lot of the short arguments and the allegation by the SEC, is a claim or an accusation that Dr. Wang used this data from the email to unblind a portion of the patients and then proceeded to manipulate the results to make cemiphalum more effective than placebo in his data. That's the claim. So I wanted to review kind of my take on this. After, I've done significant research on the company. I've talked to Dr. Wang. I've talked to Lindsay a few times. And then I've also reviewed the FDA inspection of Dr. Wang's lab. So the outside lab disclosure issue. In my opinion, Cassava should have said that it was CUNY, but I think that it has minimal impact to an informed investor that would be evaluating this information and making some sort of investment decision. Um, they did disclose that it was an outside lab that was blinded to avoid any bias. So anybody following the Cassava story, you know, would obviously know that this could be CUNY and that, or another lab that could be biased, that could somehow benefit from the results being positive. I feel like they should have disclosed that it was Wang and CUNY. I do. But minimal impact actually occurred to investors or harmed investors as a result of them not disclosing it. You know, the lab work was done by Lund. They didn't disclose that. They disclosed outside academic lab. And so it could have encompassed Lund. I don't know if they did biomarker work at other labs, but I don't think it really impacted the stock. It made people think that these results are more reliable given their disclosure. Potential unblinding actions. My thoughts on this is it was obviously accidental. They got this crazy data from Lund that didn't make any sense, and it's perfectly natural for Lindsay to do some collaboration with her academic partner to determine whether he had any additional questions, and I think that she never intended to actually unblind Dr. Wang. And they said it could have been used to partially unblind some of the patients. So at some point before the Dr. Wang got did the bioanalysis for Cassava, he got an email. He could have unblinded them. Reading between the lines on the disclosure, Cassava didn't say that he did unblind, nor did they say that they had proof that he was unblinded or any evidence. They said that he could have used it to unblind. In my conversations with Dr. Wang, he has many reasons on why he didn't use that email to unblind the patients. I personally do not believe that he did unblind himself as the SEC suspects for those patients. This is I want to go into some more detail on the big accusation that by all the shorts in the SEC and Dr. Wang, against Dr. Wang, that he actually manipulated the results of the phase 2 biomarkers. Notably, as I've mentioned before, it's absent from the DOJ indictment. They didn't mention that in his indictment that they arraigned him on just a couple weeks ago. So this information that I'm using to kind of come up with my thoughts on this is from the FDA inspection. That was an inspection that was disclosed by Science from Charles Piller, and lengthy conversations I've had with Dr. Wang. After reviewing the FDA inspection of Dr. Wang, and when the CUNY the CUNY lab and talking to Dr. Wang, I see the likelihood the results reported are actually directionally accurate as being far larger than the likelihood that he successfully manipulated the results. There are two ways. There's two ways that Dr. Wang could manipulate the results. One is by directly modifying the data in the Excel sheet that was exported by the ELISA machine, and two, by actually manipulating somehow diluting the samples and making it so the samples going in were changed or edited or diluted in a way that would change the results. So if you think about the ELISA process, you put the samples on glass basically, and they go into the ELISA machine, and the machine outputs a timestamp and a reading. The values and timestamps are basically just logged into a sheet. That whole set of biomarker data is then pushed out and analyzed through a statistics program, and it does a linear regression of all the data and comes up with values for each of the patients of concentration levels with the starting, ending, and then they can calculate the change between those, and they give that Dr. Wayne gives that final output by patient and blinded to the team for them to analyze in the stats team. So the FDA reviewed the original Excel output. They reviewed the statistical analysis and actually, told him he should have done it as nonlinear versus linear. And the recording of the triplicate readings, start and end and change from baseline. They only found a couple errors, and it was just things missing where he only selected a couple fields for the average instead of three, um, and there's a couple typos. But as they did the analysis of that at the company and at Dr. Wang's level, the changes resulting from those suggestions from the FDA, they were not mandatory. They were suggestions, didn't make a material change to the data. So let's kind of go through that. How would you manipulate the data? So you would have to, it would be quite challenging mathematically, and I would love to have a conversation with a statistician or a biostats person that could talk through this because I'm not an expert on this. You would have to change the machine readings that came out before the linear regression outputs to alter the starting and ending values to force the change by baseline for all of these records across 13 biomarkers. The ELISA results were done in triplicate. So you would actually have to somehow um, do like a reverse linear regression back and change the value that came out of the machine. Now, this is assuming that it's ever been challenged that he did change the value in the machine, which nobody actually has. And um, you would have to, even if you did alter it, you'd have to do it in triplicate, so 3 times the 64 patients, times 2 because you'd have to do the starting and ending values, times 13 biomarkers. So you would have to somehow edit the unblinded, the potentially unblinded values of the patients across 4,992 values. This would have to be done within the time frame that you and a lab partner physically did the biomarker work during COVID while there's timestamp evidence from each of the machine readouts. This would also have to be done without leaving a trace of evidence that the FDA would see when they came and did their inspection. The manipulation of the machine outputs to manipulate the results is simply not possible given the time restraints in the FDA inspection analysis. Um, there may be some evidence that the DOJ has, but if they had that evidence that showed that the original output from the Excel sheet with the ELISA machine data outputs, why wouldn't they have charged him with it? See, I don't think there is any manipulation, and the FDA reviewed it, and they didn't give him any warnings or anything that said that these results were invalid. They just offered some suggestions for a non-GLP lab as to what they would have done if he was a GLP lab. So if you fully analyze, the potential accusations and would Dr. Wang have been able to leverage the unblinded information about the patients to manipulate the values in the Excel sheets, it just doesn't seem plausible. Um, the time constraints, the fact that the FDA didn't really see any major issues in the translation of the machine data in through the data that was used in the statistical analysis. In other words, they didn't find that the link between the machine data and the values in the spreadsheets done with the linear regression were wrong or way off base. They just suggested that maybe he should try to fit it with a nonlinear regression. But as he did that, the values didn't change materially. And then the small corrections to some of the formulas in his spreadsheet to make the results change. So it doesn't seem like it's plausible at all that he manipulated any values in the sheets um, to make the biomarkers look better. So then it comes to the other way that these values could be changed. It would be through the dilution of samples to manipulate the results that the ELISA machine output. So if we're saying the values coming out of the machine didn't get altered, then maybe he made the machine made the samples go so that they would result in better results. And the way to do that would be for the placebo, if you're trying to make uh, the data look better, you would and the value was supposed to go down to make it look better. Um, I'm sorry, you would want to make the value look worse because it's a placebo. So you want them to perform worse. And let's say it was a biomarker that when it went up, it means the patient's getting worse on Alzheimer's disease. You would try to make it go down. So you would dilute the 28-day sample, and then you would run it through and make that value lower, and the placebo gets worse. Or on the other hand, if you wanted to make the values get better, you would dilute the starting point so that the ending point was higher. Um, it seems logical, right? Yeah, he just diluted the values to make it work out better. But there's two major things that make that impossible. Impossibility number one, the biomarker levels at the time of dilution are unknown. So you don't know whether that patient has a high value for a biomarker and where, like, let's say a 10% dilution would actually have no impact on the readings, or if they have a really low value and a dilution would actually take it off of the scale and make the biomarker totally undetectable. Understand? So because you don't know the values of the biomarkers that you're actually do the reading, the dilution of those values can totally corrupt and not even have a good effect on some, a major effect on others, but you don't know because you don't know the value of the biomarker. It makes no sense. The impossibility number two, um, there's two types of biomarkers in Alzheimer's disease. There's one, AB42, that when it goes up, it's improving, right? When all the other biomarkers, when they go down, they're improving on Alzheimer's disease. So that means they're getting better, or vice versa. They go up when they're getting worse, or AB42 has a tendency to go down, go down when they're getting worse. So if you think about it, these samples are in vials, and then they're taking out the vials and they're putting them in aliquots. The aliquots are what the scientist takes and puts onto the actual glass that they'll be measuring these biomarkers on the ELISA machine with. And so the aliquot that was done with had AB42, total tau, and p-tau 181 in it. So if you were to dilute this sample in the aliquot, you would actually improve two of the biomarkers and hurt the third. And that's not the way the data ended up coming out. So they go in opposite directions. It's literally impossible to move these two biomarkers in opposite directions with a dilution. So it's impossible. On top of that, like I mentioned in the first one, actually, messing around with this is an insane undertaking, which is the third key point. Because of the extreme sophistication and precision required to somehow manipulate the samples of about 4,992 readings that were done very quickly over a 2 to 3 day period during COVID, the likelihood of a total tragic outcome is so much higher than actually pulling off this task of improving the results. Nobody in the world could pull that task off. It's impossible. So I think the summary that I just reviewed is why the SEC and DOJ's investigations took so long. They rightfully saw some smoke. And maybe the shorts and the people that did the whistleblower complaint rightfully saw some smoke. But no matter how they tried and how hard they worked, they couldn't find the fire. That's why they took so long. That's why maybe the DOJ didn't include this biomarker manipulation in their indictment because they didn't have solid evidence. Even if someone somehow did have the evidence that he pulled off this impossible task, it doesn't matter one bit to the FDA. The FDA makes their decision primarily based on clinical cognition data from clinical trial sites that had nothing to do with this biomarker work. other than collecting the samples. And that would be from phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. They didn't make the decision based on a non-GLP lab that did the biomarker work. It's safety data and clinical cognition data that matters. So here's the other disclosure issue that was raised in the 8K. Basically has to do with the CANTAB readings. So you have the biomarker data that was done, and then the cognition data. This is a 28-day study. So the cognition data in Alzheimer's disease on a 28-day study, anybody that follows drug development in AD knows that that's not a data point that's going to be incredibly important. It takes time for an Alzheimer's patient and volatility of their disease to really show in a long-term analysis of their cognition, 12 to 18 months, hundreds of patients. So that aside, when they did the study, they actually did exclude a number of patients. When they reported it in the September 14th press release. They only had 37 out of 64 were in the statistical analysis for the episodic memory, and 57 out of 64 were in the special working memory statistical analysis. So, it's almost half of the patients were excluded on the first one, and you had 7 patients that were on the second one. They did disclose that patients taking semiphylum were included, but any rational person looking at the report would assume that meant the 50 milligram and 100 milligram arms. They did a February, they published the paper about, that was like a pre-published paper where they did talk about that these were, that some of the patients were excluded. The most and least impaired subjects were removed by baseline score, and subjects who performed so poorly that they couldn't have understood the task. They said it was to eliminate ceiling effects. Problem is that was a few months. That was 5 months after the original. And in April of 2021, they did do a full disclosure of all of the CANTAB inclusion-exclusion data. So we had that in April, but between September and February, we really didn't know that data didn't include all the patients. Here's my take on this: is the disclosure failure with little to no impact would have little to no impact on informed investors making the decision. I mentioned earlier, it takes 12 to 24 months of cognition data from an Alzheimer's patient to actually give you data that you can rely on, and then it takes more than 64 patients. So they said in the release that it's for directional purposes only, and while I think they failed to disclose the cognition results properly. They should have said what the exclusions were, or at least said that how many were in each of these readings. To not do it, I think there's an issue there. I don't know what made them make that decision, but I feel it was the wrong one. But they did say that it's directional, and anybody that studies Alzheimer's disease research knows that 64 patients for 1 month, it's not any sort of reliable data that you would use to make an investment decision. The biomarkers, yes. If we see movement in biomarkers, that's meaningful, but cognition data is way too volatile for 1 month. And I think, it's in the past too. They fully disclosed it in April, so this is over 3 years ago. They corrected the record. So I don't really see how the SEC could make a big fine for that. So I guess kind of go back to the beginning. I don't think that Cassava should get a giant fine from the SEC. I see that they could get a slap on the wrist. But they could have disclosed that it was CUNY, not not a truly independent lab. Um, I don't believe the unblinding potential was intentional. And I also don't believe that Dr. Wang actually used it to unblind. And then I see no way for the results to be manipulated, um, either through the Excel sheets, as because the FDA looked over that, or by diluting samples to improve the results. It's not possible. It's not feasible. And I think that's what we'll see over time. Um, and maybe we'll see some of this in the court case. But since they didn't accuse Dr. Wang in the indictment of it, I'm not seeing that's going to come up there either. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the 8K and the implications of potential fine and wrongdoing. I had made this video a couple weeks ago, so I wanted to do a quick follow-up. The There's some additional information that I got that gives further confirmation that it's very unlikely that the results that Dr. Wang performed for the reanalysis of the phase 2b biomarkers is very unlikely to have any manipulation in it. Um, when Cassava went to publish the biomarkers to a journal, the journal was concerned that the semifilum drug was actually interacting with uh, some of the assays and therefore was making the results invalid. So they did a blinded analysis of some samples that were heavily infused with semifilum to see if the results changed. He ran the samples blinded, and the concentration levels in these samples, I don't know exactly how many, but let's just say 10 to 20, were extremely close to the original results. So if somehow he miraculously performed this dilution stunt to make the original reanalysis invalid, this reanalysis that was then again blinded um, would have shown a radically different value from those original diluted samples, and he had no idea which ones were which. The conclusion is just this layers additional facts or evidence that Cassava and Dr. Wang are an honest team that have been pursuing a cure to Alzheimer's disease. I've looked into hundreds of these accusations by short sellers, and every time I come to a conclusion that this accusation of this big fraud is just totally wrong. I also wanted to do an update on my current thoughts on the whole SEC and DOJ investigation. I talked to a former SEC prosecutor and SEC attorney. She said that whenever the SEC and DOJ are collaborating on a case, the SEC always wants the DOJ to act first so they can tack on their charges to the DOJ indictment. So this all started in August of 2021 when the citizens petition came out and the SEC and DOJ took complaints from those same petitioners and investigated Cassava and Dr. Wang. June 28th of 24, the DOJ decided to indict Dr. Wang. July 1st, so just a couple days later, Cassava released an 8K uh, that was informing them that there was additional information given them from the SEC. Cassava investigated that internally, and on July 17th, they did their big announcement that there was the departure of Remy and Lindsay, and the search is now commencing for a new CEO. So here's my hypothesis of this sequence of events. I think once the DOJ decided that they were going to indict Dr. Wang and not Cassava, they informed the SEC that. And the SEC is like, okay, I guess that means we need to give Cassava all the information that we have that we're really concerned about and work towards a settlement. And that the DOJ basically bowed out of Cassava and they're working directly with Cassava. The SEC is working with getting a settlement from Cassava. So I think it's incoming. I think that the board decided to part ways with Remy. We've talked about the different reasons that could be done, from a reason other than an SEC a disclosure issue. And I think there's one I think there's an incoming settlement very soon. The SEC leadership has pushed for harsher fines. Originally, I thought that somewhere between 2 and 10% of the money raised from September 15th press release, the reanalysis, which was $75 million that they raised. I thought maybe 7 to $10 million fine was likely, which wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I'm looking at, there could be a bigger fine. I don't really know. It just depends on Cassava's team negotiating with the SEC. So the range, though, is 1 to 75 million. Whatever that ends up being, it takes a major risk off the table. So now, with an SEC settlement, the SEC risks are gone, and it all but cements that the DOJ's risk at Cassava is minimal to zero. And the company can move on and focus on Rethink with the new leadership team. Okay, to summarize what I reviewed today. So it reviewed the extreme unlikelihood that the phase 2 biomarkers were manipulated in any way. And they indicate that semifelum does actually improve Alzheimer's biomarkers. That's in addition to the Quanterix data that we already know exists. And it will be confirmed in phase 3, I believe. The company did have some disclosure issues with regards to the outside lab and how inclusive the CANTAB results actually were, how many samples or how many exclusions there were. And it will result in some sort of discipline that, Remy and Lindsay had to leave the company, and the company will receive some sort of fine from the SEC. I don't really know how much, but somewhere between 1 million and 75 million, so maybe something in the middle. I think that the SEC and DOJ risk will be removed very soon, and the company can move on and focus on getting semifelum out to the 42 million patients worldwide that are suffering from Alzheimer's disease after they get FDA approval. Why do I think the FDA will approve semifelum? We know the pill is safe with no drug-related side effects. It's a twice-a-day pill. The biomarker data shows some confirmation that there's improvement with biomarkers that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. Phase 2 open label data shows stability of disease for mild patients for 24 months. There's evidence of super responders in about half of the mild patients in the different readouts that came from that open label study. Confirming or also corroborating that evidence of the data from open label, we have 8 family testimonies that report results like falling down from the effects of Alzheimer's disease before semifelum to dancing and still dancing 3.5 years after they started treatment. People that have been unable to go shopping at the store, but then are able to take a list to the store and actually come home successfully with all the items on the list. Unable to drive to doing an 8-hour road trip. Unable to do lawn work, to be doing lawn work, unable to make coffee, to be making coffee. So one family reported that their mother was antisocial and angry as she felt the effects of Alzheimer's disease. She became friendly and social again, became herself again, and lasted 3.5 years after the treatment started. Find me a caregiver that can say about any of these things happening in patients in Alzheimer's disease, especially over a long period of time. 3.5 years later, 20, many patients, I think 160 some patients that made it all the way to 24 months that have stability of disease. So it just doesn't happen. Alzheimer's disease, you might see 1 month an improvement, next month a decline, but 12, 18, 24 months later, it just doesn't happen. Talk to the caregivers. It's happening. So thanks for watching. I'll work overtime to get more videos like this out because it is a complicated story. And I found this is actually a pretty good idea, a good way to wrap a number of concepts together in a cohesive video. So take care, and we will talk more later.